You know, lately, I've been going through a retro phase. So for today, I want to share how I went from this 2D illustration to this 3D character. But hey, I'm Kevin. It's like Kevin, but it's Kevin. There's something magical about video game graphics from the pre-2000s. With the launch of the PS1 and N64, 3D graphics in gaming had just started making their way into the mainstream. Things were much more simpler back then. Games often heavily relied on visual trickery to create the illusion of real-time graphics. But it's all these limitations that led to this iconic style that defined the pre-2000s. Whether it was the unsettling grunge horror aesthetic that came from the low-res bit-crushed textures, or the more cutesy, comfy, lo-fi vibes that came from the simplification of its visuals, this era, despite being well past its expiry date, is having a huge comeback. There are tons of indie games that use this pre-2000s aesthetic to great effect. I myself have recently done my own set of experimentations trying to replicate this style. So let's discuss some key elements that define this aesthetic. And the most noticeable one of them all has got to be those blocky, low poly models. You see, a lot of constraints were tied to artists in order to maintain performance on these older consoles. A character's triangle count would typically land between 400 to 800 tries. Textures would also similarly have restrictive limitations, with them on the PS1 generally being about 128 by 128 pixels, with the absolute max being 256 by 256. Now, I could yap on about the technical side forever, but if you're curious, linked in the description below is an awesome post on Polycount by Polyhertz that has a great overview on retro graphics. Seriously, do check this one out. So initially, my focus was on creating PS1 inspired visuals. However, today I wanted to aim a little higher in fidelity, something more akin to what you'd see in a handheld console like the PSP or DS. So with all of this in mind, we're going to try stay as true as possible to the style, but we're going to take a few liberties. This isn't a one-to-one recipe, this is inspired. So I'm going to import a base mesh I previously made to use as a starting point. It's nothing real complex, but with that being said, I will be posting the final model and base mesh up on Sketchfab in case you'd like to study the models in further detail. The main key thing I want to note here with the base mesh is that I've tried to keep my UVs somewhat straight, as with the smaller texture size, things can look a bit off otherwise. We'll expand upon that more later. Now, with Big Ugly imported and the concept in place, we're finally ready to get started. So we begin by just lining up the geometry to match the concept. The main thing I'm focusing on is just nailing the silhouette of the character. If I don't think an element is particularly important to the character's silhouette, then I just ignore modeling it, and will instead opt to draw it on during the texture stage. I've also applied some quick materials just so I can have a general idea of how the shapes are playing overall. Some of you may have noticed I've got some triangles placed on the model, and that's because for low poly models, triangles are your friends. If you notice edges flipping out like this, slice in a triangle and that will control the orientation of that face. And another thing you might also notice is that I've got some triangles around the knee and elbow. The purpose of these triangles is to have better deformation for when the joints bend. With all of that in mind, we just carry on with the block out. Now, with the block out done, it's time to move on to the UVs. Our main focus is to try and straighten up the UVs and ensure there's an equal spread of pixels. I'm gonna cheat here and have two textures for the character, one for just the body and one for everything else. This is sort of going against my retro aesthetic, however, my current poly count isn't helping my case here either. But regardless, for this piece, I did want it to be a bit more higher in fidelity, so we'll just keep things as is. Now, when working with low-res textures, you might want to turn on pixel snapping. To do this in Blender, under the overlay options, under guides, select pixel. and then enable snapping, and under its settings, select increment and tick absolute grid. This will effectively give you pixel snapping, but I have noticed it being slightly off at times when selecting clusters. To remedy this, you can use selected to pixels, which can be found under the UV's menu within Snap. I've got this bound to my mouse as this will be something I'll be using throughout the UV process. You also want to make sure the texture you are viewing is the correct resolution you're aiming to match. I'll often use a color grid when I'm working on the UVs as it'll allow me to visually see any UV warping or improper pixel density. I'm essentially using the default Blender color grid, but I've just removed the numbers as they were a bit too distracting. When working in this style, I tend to make sure all my UVs are straightened. This does mean my UVs are more prone to texture warping, so I do need to be more mindful of my topology here. This is why during this stage, I'll often be readjusting some of my topology to ensure that the texture warping is as minimal as possible. While this can be a pain to deal with, I much prefer texture painting when my UVs are straight like this. When I'm working on low res textures, it can be difficult to paint some areas due to the lack of pixels. But this technique allows me to have more control over how my pixels orientate. It also creates a pixel perfect output, which simplifies the texturing process. Now, the size of your UVs are also extremely important. Throughout this process, I am checking the seams of my UVs and ensuring each UV island has an equal pixel density. If they aren't equal, then this means you'll start to see some nasty seams, which isn't the worst thing, as you can use these seams to showcase any separations of the model. But for me, I feel like challenging myself by having an equal pixel density across the entire model except for the face. The face is the only exception as I wanted to have double the resolution, which will allow me to have much more detail. And since we won't be seeing the back of the face as much, I've done the opposite and I've scaled it to be significantly smaller. But with the UVs done, it's finally time to start getting creative and work on painting the textures. You see, when it comes to this style, a ton of its flavor comes from how we approach its textures. This is why I want to quickly discuss lighting. Older game consoles had much more restrictive lighting capabilities. Developers had to heavily rely on pre-rendered lighting, which would be most evident in the backgrounds of games. The Final Fantasy series has great examples of this. So, due to these graphical limitations, characters would heavily rely on textures with baked lighting. Now, with that in mind, let's start texturing. Before this model, I'd used Substance Painter as my main texturing tool. But this time around, I decided to give RickyC a try as I've heard great things for when it comes to hand painting textures. So, with that being said, we still boot up Substance Painter for our first step, which is baking our maps. I'm aware you can do some of this in RickyC, but I'm using Substance just because I have a nifty little smart material that I've built, which will give me everything I need, so I'll quickly do my bakes, tweak my material, and then export these textures for me to use in RickyC. And now with RickyC booted, it's time to finally start painting. Out of every stage, this has got to be the most freeing point of this entire process. If you've done everything correctly, then all you have to do is just paint. Throughout this process, I'll be constantly flipping between RickyC and Photoshop, and this is because they just work perfectly in tandem with each other, making it really easy for me to swap between a 2D and a 3D painting workflow. So I first start off by painting in grayscale only, where my main focus is just capturing the correct color values. It's during this stage that I also recapture those missing details that I chose not to initially model. With the grayscale painting done, it's time to add color. To add color, I just create a flats layer that I place on top of my stack and set the blending mode to hard light. Once I've got my colors blocked out like this, then I do one final pass under a new regular layer, which I'll use just to do some overpainting. And once I'm happy, we're ready to move on to rendering. Before we hit that render button, we'll quickly rig up the character using Auto Rig Pro so we can get it into pose. As far as compositing goes, all we have to do is slap on some simple composite nodes within Blender from Drip's PSX effects. This will get us the retro look we're aiming for. After all is said and done, this is our final result. So that's how I approach a more retro-inspired 3D character. Just a reminder that I will be uploading the final model and base mesh on Sketchfab. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can also purchase the base mesh. Now that I'm in the post-project stage, I can definitely identify some areas that I would have chosen to do differently now. I do think that going with the 2 texture maps was a bit overboard. I wish I had stored it all within the one texture or as 2 128 size texture maps. I originally went for the 2 larger maps as I wanted more resolution for the face, but I quickly realized towards the end that it was a bit overkill. I'm also a bit unsure about having the full set of fingers, as I think adopting the hand-midden approach would have been more effective here. But despite these issues, I'm still very happy with what I made, as I learnt a lot during the process. So closing up, I know I spent a lot of today yapping about the technicalities of this style and that I broke quite a fair few of these rules in the process. I guess my main takeaway from this project was to try and not get too bogged down with the specifics and just make something cool. Because at the end of the day, you should be your own chef and cook to your taste. But hey, that's been me. Have a wonderful day, everyone, and remember, stay safe and stay creative.